Sometimes life has a cruel way of reminding you just how invisible you can be, even in your own home. Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you tried to fit in, to prove yourself, to be loved, you were always treated like a background character in your own family? That's how my life was, every single day, and the people responsible weren't strangers, they were my own parents. If you're watching this right now, let me just say, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because stories like mine will show you how quickly tables can turn in life, and you don't want to miss what happens when people finally get what they deserve. Growing up, I wasn't treated like a daughter, not even like a family member, but like a servant whose only purpose was to obey. My parents adored appearances, they loved impressing neighbors, relatives, and especially people who had money, influence, and power. But when it came to me, I wasn't the child they showed off. I was the one they ordered around, the one who washed the dishes, cooked meals, ironed clothes, and cleaned the house as though I was their unpaid maid. My mother would hand me a broom with no hesitation while my younger brother got to play video games in the living room. My father would bark orders at me to polish his shoes, iron his shirts, and set the table whenever he invited people over. And if I made a mistake, if a single plate had a spot or a shirt wasn't crisp enough, I wasn't corrected like a daughter, I was scolded like staff, like some outsider who had no right to rest or breathe. The pain of it wasn't just in the chores, it was in the absence of love. There were no gentle words, no encouragement, no small gestures that made me feel seen. Instead, I grew up feeling like a shadow in my own home, like my worth was tied only to how well I could scrub a floor or prepare a meal. And I know some of you might think, maybe it wasn't so bad, maybe they just needed help, but no. You'll understand why I say that when you hear what happened the day my parents tried to impress a powerful CEO. That day became the turning point of my entire life. But before I get to that, you need to understand how deep this wound went, how much they saw me not as family but as a tool. Because when you realize the level of betrayal, the ending will hit even harder. My parents never called me princess or sweetheart, they never even called me by my name when there were tasks to be done. It was always go fetch this, clean that, make yourself useful. I used to stare at them, waiting for the smallest smile, a word of pride, but it never came. Instead, I became conditioned to think that love had to be earned through labor, that family was about transactions and appearances, not connection. Every morning, while my brother left for school with neatly packed lunches that I had prepared, I stayed behind because my parents said education wasn't necessary for me. Who will keep the house in order if you go to school? My mother said once, as if my future had no value beyond these walls. And so, while my peers learned math and science, I learned the art of silence, the weight of servitude, and the bitterness of being overlooked. I still remember the nights I would sneak into my brother's old textbooks, reading by the dim light of the kitchen lamp, just to feel like I was more than a broom in hand. Those secret studies became my only escape, the seed of something greater that even my parents didn't see growing inside me. Because as much as they tried to box me into being their maid, I carried dreams that reached far beyond their expectations. And one day, fate would give me the chance to unleash them in a way that shocked everyone, especially them. But until then, I endured. I endured the humiliation of serving guests who looked at me with pity, the sting of hearing my parents boast about my brother's achievements while ignoring my existence, the ache of being told I wasn't meant for greatness. I endured it all, not knowing that soon, in the very moment they were desperate to win approval from a CEO, the world would turn upside down, and the girl they dismissed would be the one everyone called boss. The thing about being treated like a maid in your own home is that after a while, you begin to believe that's all you are worth. I carried that weight on my shoulders through my teenage years, cooking meals for parties I wasn't invited to, setting tables for celebrations where my name wasn't even mentioned, and cleaning up messes left by guests who didn't even know I was the daughter of the house. My parents perfected the art of keeping me invisible when outsiders came around. "Don't stand there, go get the snacks," my mother would whisper harshly while smiling sweetly at her friends. "Keep the tea hot, and don't talk too much," my father would add as though I might embarrass them just by opening my mouth. I became a ghost who floated between kitchen and living room, balancing trays and swallowing my pride. Yet, as much as they tried to erase me, I was quietly building myself. Every book I stole a glance at, every article I read late at night when chores were finally done, every overheard conversation from my father's business meetings, it all became part of my secret education. You see, while my parents thought they were limiting me, they were unknowingly pushing me toward independence. My brother, who had everything handed to him, grew comfortable and careless, but I grew hungry, observant, and determined. There was a fire inside me that no amount of scrubbing floors could put out. And that fire blazed the brightest on the day my parents scrambled to prepare for the visit of a CEO they desperately wanted to impress. I remember the morning vividly. My mother woke me before sunrise, ordering me to polish the silverware until it gleamed, to press the curtains so they looked brand new, to prepare a meal that would outshine the entire neighborhood. My father kept pacing, rehearsing his lines, eager to make connections that could finally elevate his social standing. They wanted to climb ladders they hadn't earned, and they thought their best chance was to charm a man whose influence stretched across industries. But here's the twist, they had no idea that my path had already crossed with his, quietly, secretly, in ways that would make their jaws drop. As I worked that morning, I kept silent, watching the frantic energy around me. My parents criticized every move I made, claiming the soup wasn't flavorful enough, the napkins weren't folded properly, the flowers weren't fresh. They were nervous, desperate to present perfection, and to them, I was just the unpaid help to achieve it. Yet, inside me, a strange calm grew, because unlike them, I wasn't afraid of being in the CEO's presence. I wasn't intimidated, because months earlier, through one of my late-night studies and a stroke of courage, I had submitted an innovative idea to his company's Open Youth program, an idea that had not only been noticed but also celebrated. They didn't know I had secretly become part of something larger than our suffocating home. They didn't know the man they were about to meet already knew my name, not as a servant, not as an afterthought, but as a thinker, a creator, someone with potential. And while they rushed to iron tablecloths and perfect fake smiles, I was quietly waiting for the moment that would shatter their illusion of control. When the CEO finally arrived, stepping into our home with a calm but commanding presence, my parents almost tripped over themselves trying to greet him. They showered him with compliments, guided him to the best seat, and offered him dishes I had spent hours preparing. I stood in the background, holding a tray, invisible as always, until his eyes fell on me. And in that moment, in front of everyone, he smiled and said the words that froze my parents in place, "There she is, the brilliant mind I told my board about. My boss for the new project." The room fell into a silence so heavy that even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo louder than usual. My parents froze, their fake smiles crumbling like fragile glass as the CEO's words hung in the air, "My boss for the new project." My mother's hand, which had been adjusting the lace on the table, stilled midair. My father, who was about to boast about his family values, lost his voice completely. For the first time in my life, the two people who had treated me like I was invisible were suddenly staring at me as if they had never seen me before. The CEO rose slightly from his seat, extending his hand toward me, and said my name with warmth and respect. Two things I had never heard in that tone under this roof. I remember the way my heart pounded in my chest, not from fear but from the overwhelming realization that years of quiet endurance had finally led to this moment. My parents had invited him here, thinking they would impress him with their shallow hospitality, but instead, he was here to acknowledge me, the daughter they had reduced to a maid. He spoke to me directly, telling the room how my idea had sparked innovation within his company, how my submission had been ranked among the top by his board, and how he believed in giving young, hidden talents a chance to lead. I still remember the sparkle in his eyes when he said, "She might not realize it yet, but she's going to change things." The irony was brutal. My parents, who had clipped my wings, were now watching someone else describe me as though I had already taken flight. The shame on their faces was almost tangible. My mother's lips trembled as she forced a laugh, trying to take credit. "Oh yes, we always encouraged her. She's such a bright girl," she stammered, but her voice betrayed her disbelief. My father, on the other hand, tried to mask his shock by straightening his tie and pretending this had all been part of his grand plan. But the CEO wasn't blind, he could read the tension, he could see the cracks, and I think part of him enjoyed watching their charade unravel. For me, that moment was both sweet and surreal. All those nights spent hunched over borrowed books, the sacrifices of stolen sleep, the countless times I cried silently into my pillow, all of it flashed through my mind like a reel of memories. And here I was, no longer the ghost in the kitchen, no longer the servant in her own home, but someone recognized, valued, and given a title that my parents could never strip away, boss. The word felt foreign on my ears, yet it sank deep into my bones as if it had always belonged to me. The CEO then asked me to sit beside him, to discuss the upcoming project, as though I were the most important person in the room. My parents hovered awkwardly at the edges, serving food with stiff hands, their carefully curated image of authority collapsing right before their guest. And while they scrambled to maintain appearances, I sat tall, answering questions, sharing ideas, and realizing that the power dynamic in this household had shifted forever. It wasn't about revenge, it was about revelation. They had spent years treating me like a nobody, but in the eyes of the world beyond these walls, I had become somebody. And in that moment, as my parents avoided my gaze, I felt something I had never felt before: liberation. After the CEO's words, the rest of that evening became something I can only describe as surreal, almost like living inside a dream I had written for myself years ago but never believed would come true. The CEO treated me with respect throughout the dinner, asking me questions about my perspective, about the way I saw problems in the industry, and how I believed they could be solved. He spoke to me as an equal, not as a child, not as someone unworthy, but as a partner whose opinions mattered. My parents sat rigid in their seats, forcing laughs when they thought it was appropriate, nodding excessively to cover up their shock, but their eyes kept betraying them. I could see the disbelief and humiliation swirling behind their forced composure. Every time the CEO called me boss, I felt the knife twist a little deeper into their pride. And yet, they couldn't say a word, because correcting him would mean revealing the truth, that they had never treated me like anything more than their maid. After the meal, when the CEO excused himself to make a call, my father leaned toward me, his whisper sharp and cold. "What is this nonsense? What have you gotten yourself into?" My mother's nails dug into her napkin as she hissed, "You should have told us. Do you know how embarrassing this looks for us?" The irony of their words almost made me laugh. Embarrassing for them? After years of ignoring me, using me, belittling me, suddenly it was embarrassing that I had succeeded without their permission. I didn't answer them, though. I simply sat with my head high, because for once, silence was louder than their accusations. When the CEO returned, he announced with a smile that he looked forward to working with me closely, even suggesting that I might one day lead an entire branch of his company if I kept showing the same brilliance. My parents clapped nervously, their hands stiff, their smiles plastic. That night, after the CEO left, the mask they had worn all evening shattered completely. The moment the door closed behind him, my father slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware, and shouted, "How dare you make us look like fools in front of him? You've been sneaking behind our backs, pretending to be something you're not." My mother added venom to his words, her voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "You've always been ungrateful. We gave you a home, food, and this is how you repay us, by humiliating us?" Their anger was almost laughable, because beneath it was fear. Fear that their control over me was slipping away, fear that the girl they had kept hidden in the kitchen was now standing in the light where they couldn't dim her. I stood there, listening to their fury, and for the first time I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply looked at them with a calm that startled even me. "No," I said softly, "you didn't give me a home. You gave me a cage. And tonight, I walked out of it." The silence that followed was deafening. They weren't used to me talking back, they weren't used to me holding my ground, and for a long moment they didn't know what to say. My brother, who had been watching quietly from the staircase, finally spoke up, his voice uncertain but filled with curiosity. "She's really the boss? Like, for real?" I turned to him, and for the first time, I didn't feel bitterness toward him, only pity. Because unlike me, he had been coddled into weakness, spoon-fed a life that had left him unprepared for the real world. "Yes," I said. For real. His eyes widened, and I could see the beginning of something shift inside him, too. That night ended with slammed doors and bitter silence, but for me, it was the beginning of everything. Because once respect has been spoken into existence, it cannot be taken back. My parents might have still seen me as their maid, but the world had started to see me as something greater, and there was no undoing that truth. In the days that followed, everything shifted. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy, but the balance of power in my life had irreversibly changed. The CEO kept his word. Within a week, I was invited to his office, not as someone fetching tea or cleaning after others, but as someone seated at the conference table, being listened to, respected, and introduced as the young visionary behind our new initiative. For the first time, I walked into a building where people saw me, where my voice mattered, where I wasn't told to stay quiet but encouraged to speak. It was overwhelming at first. After all, I had spent my life in the background, convinced that invisibility was my destiny. And now, suddenly, I was being asked to lead, to create, to imagine bigger than I ever thought possible. My parents, on the other hand, didn't know how to handle the new reality. At home, my father tried to pretend he had always known I was destined for success. He told neighbors, "She gets her brains from me," as though claiming credit could erase years of neglect. My mother, meanwhile, shifted between false pride and simmering resentment, praising me in public but accusing me in private of being ungrateful for not giving them recognition. But deep down, they both knew the truth. They hadn't built me, they had buried me, and I had clawed my way out of the dirt on my own. And while they still wanted to cling to control, they couldn't anymore. Every time the CEO visited, every time my name was mentioned in a newspaper article or in company announcements, the reminder hit them harder. The girl they had treated like a maid was now someone important, someone they couldn't ignore. I remember one evening, months later, when we attended a company gala. My parents came along, dressed in their finest clothes, desperate to mingle and prove themselves among the wealthy. But instead of them shining, it was me who was greeted, me who was congratulated, me who was pulled into conversations that mattered. At one point, a respected investor turned to my parents and said, "You must be so proud of your daughter. She's extraordinary." And I watched as they smiled awkwardly, trapped between their old reality and the new one. That was the moment I realized something profound. The tables had turned permanently. No matter how much they tried to rewrite the past, the future had already branded me as something they never believed I could be. A leader. And I carried that not with arrogance, but with quiet strength, because I knew where I came from. I knew the weight of scrubbing floors and wiping dishes. I knew the sting of being ignored. And I knew that my success wasn't just about proving them wrong, it was about proving to myself that I was always worth more than how they treated me. If you're still listening to me now, I want you to take this message with you: never let the people who underestimate you define your worth. Sometimes, the ones closest to us are the ones who blind us to our own potential. But when life finally gives you that chance, when someone finally calls you boss in a world that once called you invisible, you'll realize you were never powerless. You were preparing. So don't give up. Don't let their voices drown out your own. And if you felt something in my story, if it gave you even a spark of hope, make sure to subscribe, because I promise you, this is just one of many reminders that even the most overlooked among us can rise to become unforgettable.